Hey guys, welcome to my 2D array tutorial. This tutorial will cover on how a 2D array works, as well as how you can break down a 2D array in a way where you will be able to understand it more so than how to create a 2D array, much like on what you would see in other tutorials on YouTube, Udemy, or other videos that you might find. This tutorial will be covered in Java, however, this video will still help you for other languages such as C++ or C#, since the concept is essentially the same. So before I go into 2D arrays, it's important to understand how a regular array would work. If you don't understand regular arrays, then you will be absolutely clueless on 2D arrays. So I will briefly be covering on how a regular array works first. So let's get started with breaking down a regular array. So let's say you go to a store and get some fruit here, right? You can think of these fruits like string variables, or you can also think of them as any other primitive data type, such as an int. You can think of an array like a container for your string or int variables, or in the case of the fruits here, you've gotten a basket. You wouldn't necessarily want to be carrying fruit around the store without something to store them in, right? Especially if you're going to get more than 3 fruit. It would be too much to carry with your hands. That's why you get a basket to store your fruit into them, so it's more convenient and easier for you to carry them around the store. Arrays are essentially the same concept. You wouldn't necessarily want to make 20 separate string variables, especially if they all relate to each other in some way. You would want to store them within a container, in which your container in this case would be an array. So doing this will save yourself time, space within your program, and you'll be more efficient with how you plan to use your variables. So as you can see on the PowerPoint here, these are 2 different ways that you can create an array on your IDE. Each way has its own pros and cons, so how you plan to make your arrays is entirely dependent on what you plan to do with your array, but they both essentially do the same thing. And as I stated previously, I'm not going to be covering on how to make an array or a 2D array, but there are a ton of resources out there if you're interested in learning more about that. So now that we covered how a regular array works, what exactly would a 2D array look like, and how would that work? So remember earlier when I stated that an array is a container for a string variable or for primitive data types such as like an int or a char? What if there's a way to store these containers in another container? So what if there's a way to store arrays into an array? So that concept might sound confusing at first, but this is exactly what a 2D array is. It's a container for containers. So let's go back to the fruit example that I've shown. And let's say you were to grab another basket and store 3 different types of fruit in that basket. And then you decide to grab a third basket and store 4 different types of fruits in there. Obviously, you don't want to be carrying 3 baskets around the store at once, because it's going to get to the point where you may not be able to carry all these baskets at once. So what would be the solution in this case? One solution would obviously be to store them in the shopping cart, since that seems to be the most convenient way to carry around these baskets. And concept is essentially what 2D arrays are. So let's say you had 20 different arrays of strings that all relate to each other in some way, and you're wanting to loop through all of those arrays, right? Rather than manually looping through each array, the best idea would be to store each array into an array. So essentially you're creating a 2D array for these arrays, and then you loop through the one array that contains, or you essentially loop through each array, which each array is containing your string variables or your int variables, depending on what you're using. This is why 2D arrays are very useful to have, because if you ever come across a scenario like that, then you would want to be using 2D arrays, and doing that would save yourself so much energy, so much stuff to type, and you're going to be looping through these string variables much more effectively. So to create 2D arrays, the best syntax would be to use the ones that I'm showing here on this PowerPoint, and if you want to know more information about 2D arrays, there's a bunch of resources out on the internet. I'll just try to find any sort of resources out there that you can use. So you can create a 2D array using the other example that I've shown with regular arrays, like the one I'm showing on the PowerPoint right now. And it would be good to use this if you're wanting to take an input within the 2D array. But if you're going to write it this way, the process of writing out each line would be very tedious. And if you were going to be writing it 2D array out this way, you'd be saving yourself writing a bunch of lines where you essentially are doing it when you're initializing a 2D array this way. So I would highly recommend you writing a 2D array out like with this syntax, because you're going to be saving yourself a bunch of time. And you can even take an input using the syntax for this 2D array. You can do it like this way. So overall, I would highly recommend doing writing your 2D arrays like this. And if you want to learn how to take an input for your 2D arrays, as I said, there's a bunch of resources out there you can find. So just do some research, and then you'll eventually be able to run into something that you can find. So, okay. Now, when you're writing a 2D array, I would not recommend jumping into coding right away, because if you do this, you're going to get lost real quick on what to do. So, when you're writing out a program that uses 2D arrays, the first thing I would do is draw out how you plan to use your 2D arrays, and one of the best ways to do that is drawing out a table with rows and columns, like the one I've shown here on the PowerPoint. So my fruit example, I had 3 baskets, one with 3 fruits, another with 3 fruits, and then the third with 4 fruits. So since I have 3 baskets, that means I have 3 arrays, right? Because keep in mind, the baskets are containers, and as we mentioned earlier, an array is a container. So the arrays will represent my rows in this table. Within my rows contains columns. The fruits in this case would represent my columns here. So once you know how many rows and columns you have in your 2D array, then you can start drawing out your table. And when you draw out your table, you want to make sure that you're labeling each box as well, so you know which box represents what row and column. So when you're labeling out your table, you want to start at the very top corner. And since we know that an array's index starts at 0, the first box is going to start at row 0, column 0. And when we loop through a 2D array, we always start at the first row, and then in that row we count out the columns. Once we reach the end of the column, then we're finished with that row, so we can move on to the next row. In my table, since I have 3 fruits in the first row, I count each fruit starting at 0, 0, moving on to 0, 1, and then finally going up to 0, 2. So now that I've counted out that column, I can move on to the next row, as well as the first item within that column, the row, which would be at 1, 0, and which this case, for my example here, would be at mango. That would be in 1, 0. I do the same process for that column, and once I reach the end, I move on to the final row, which is marked at 2, 0. And I do the same process for this row as well. But since we have 4 fruit in this column, the length of the column is going to be 4, and then the index of your number on the right is going to be going up to 3 rather than 2, which means that my final label will be at 2, 3. So once you've drawn out the table and have inserted a label with each table, you should then be able to fill out your table with the contents of your array, in which the example I have shown here would be my fruit. So as you can see, since orange is the first fruit in my array, it would go in box 0, 0. Apple is the next fruit in the column, so it would go in 0, 1. And then you would keep doing this process up until you get to the final fruit, which is kiwi, and that's located in the 3rd row, 4th column, which is labeled 2, 3. So that might have sounded a little confusing. You might be thinking, why is the 3rd row, 4th column labeled 2, 3? So the reason why we do this is because we have to keep in mind the indexes of the arrays. The indexes always starts at 0. And if this makes it any easier for you to think of how you can label out your boxes without thinking of array indexes too much, essentially n-1 for each number within your label. So for example, you see kiwi's labeled 2, 3, but I said it was in the 3rd row, 4th column, right? So you would think that would be labeled 3, 4, but it's not located there since you you have to start your array index at 0. So in this case, you would just have to subtract 1 in both your row and column numbers. Okay, so in my IDE here, I have this program, and I have this fruits 2D array that I'm recreating from my example that I've shown in my PowerPoint. And I have all the string variables that I've used here. Obviously, you can change anything around depending on what you want to store within your 2D array. And then below this, I have this nested for loop. So this is what we use to loop through 2D array in your IDE here. So what's going on in this nested for loop? I'm going to break this down for you. This top for loop is going to be looping through your rows here. So essentially, the second for loop is going to be looping through your columns. So essentially what's going on here is that I have a print statement here. So it's going to be printing the string variables to the console, which I've done already down here, right? So essentially what this nested for loop is doing, right? It's starting, so I initialize my row at 0. So it's going to start here. And it's going to go up to the length of the row, which in this case would be up to banana here, which would be length of 4. But keep in mind, this is an index at 3 because arrays start at an index of 0. So it's going to go up to this length. It's going to go up to the length. And then once it's done with this row, it's going to increment. And that means it's just going to move on to the next row here. So in order for this for loop to increment, it has to read each string variable that I have listed in here. And to do that, you will need another for loop within here, which reads your string variables, right? So this is what this for loop is doing. It's starting at index of 0 because our arrays always start at index of 0. And it's going up to the length of the column. This is why we have fruits at index of row here, because this row represents my int variable that I've initialized right here. So essentially, what it's doing here is that it's reading this, and then it increments, and then it goes here, and then this is increments, and then so on, and then so on. And then once it's finished with this, it's reached the length of this for loop here. So what happens is that this is done. It's done looping through this. So it goes back up to here now to see if we have to go to the next row. And we do have a next row, so this for loop would increment here. So now we're going to be at index of 1 for our row. And then we would start the same process again with our columns, where we start here, which is index of 0. We go to here, which would be index of 1. And then we go here, which would be index of 2. And then we've reached our length. So this for loop is finished for this row, which would then increment row for this top for loop here. And then we move on to the final row. And it would do the same process here. And once it's all finished, both for loops are going to be done with their process. And we end up with all of our variables, our string variables, printed to the console right here. So this is how you would loop through a 2D array. You can do a lot more cool stuff with it rather than just print out to the console. It's entirely up to whatever you may find interesting to do. Like you could possibly, for example, try to see if there's two fruits here that are the same. So like you have orange here and orange here, for example. So essentially this would be row 0, column 0, and then row 2, column 0. They contain the same fruits. So you can do some cool stuff with that. Now, one thing I want to show you here that you want to try to avoid whenever you're looping through a 2D array. You never want to go beyond the length of your rows and columns here. So, let's say if I were to add 1 to the length here, right? I can do the same thing for here. But let's say if I were to add 1 to the rows here. So what this is doing is that I'm now trying to access a row that doesn't exist. So this is saying that I want to loop to a row that's after the row. But that doesn't exist in this program. So what this is end up going to do is going to throw an array out of bounds index exception here. So when I run this, give it a second. Yeah. So as you can see down here, it threw an array index out of bounds exception because I was trying to access a row that doesn't exist. Because our row index of 3 does not exist in this program. So it's going to end up crashing the program here. And I can also do the same thing for my columns here. Now I'm trying to access a contents in my array which does not exist. There doesn't exist another item beyond banana here, right? So this is going to also throw an exception. It's going to do a lot earlier because I'm trying to access something out of here which does not exist. So you always want to keep your this within your length here. You never want to exceed it. You can do this -1 if and you want to do this if you're trying to exclude something in your array. So let's say if I didn't want to print out the last row here, right? So I would just have the -1, and that's just going to exclude this row here because I'm only going up to row 1. This, remember, fruits.length is going to go up to row 2, but if I subtract 1 from it, it's only going to go up to row 1. It's only going to go up to this row. And I'm going to run the program here to I can show you guys. So as you can see, it stopped at pineapple, which is right here. It didn't move on to this row because I have length -1. You can do the same thing for columns as well. Let's say you didn't want to include the last item in each row, right? So if I run this, it's not going to include banana, pineapple, or kiwi, right? So as you can see, it goes from strawberry. It goes from strawberry to mango. It skipped banana, so it went from here to here, and it did the same thing for pineapple here. So you see banana, it went from banana to orange, so it skipped this. So those are some cool things you can do with your 2D array. If you guys have any questions or any problems or concerns that you may have when you create 2D arrays, feel free to send me a message. I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. But other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it helped you out. And I wish you guys luck in whatever project or program you may be doing.